Shea. My name is Paul Wallace. I'm here with my co-host Michael Laurier, and today we're making a journey to the Fringe. Now, if you've ever lived in a haunted house or watched the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose or the Amityville Horror or The Exorcist, you may have some kind of an idea of what entity removal might involve in the movies and maybe in real life as well. And to explore that territory, we have with us today David Aberle. David Aberle is the host of the popular podcast Unearthing the Supernatural. He is a practitioner of entity removal, and he's a guardian of the Navajo people. So, David, a big welcome today to Journey to the Fringe.
I really appreciate it, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Now, we've met on a couple of occasions before. I'm absolutely fascinated by your work, which is not only about entity removal, but we're going to talk on that subject today. Michael and I are simply going to ply you with questions out of our own curiosity, because it is a fascinating field. I know a little bit about it from my own background in the world of church ministry, where people may be familiar with deliverance ministry. Sometimes priests get called upon to do exorcisms. So I have a bit of knowledge, but you're coming from a quite different start point. So I'm really intrigued to hear from you. What for you does entity removal look like, and how did you get drawn into this rather interesting world?
Yeah, so for me, entity removal, it's not necessarily just like what most people think of, like the demonic or demons, things of that nature. Entity removal is usually kind of going into either a patient's home or a location and trying to bring balance back to the home, the person, or just the area in general. And sometimes there's energies, there's spirits, whether they be either of darker of nature, or if they're just kind of just out of place, they don't belong in that particular energy. There are certain methodologies that I have been taught as a indigenous person, the Navajo person, to deal with these things and restore balance back to the person or place. And it kind of all started back when I was a young boy, just kind of growing up with my parents, growing up with my grandparents, and attending ceremonies a lot. And I would always attend these ceremonies with a curious mind, with an open mind. And signs started to come about of kind of my curiosity developing into something more. And by the age of 13, I was selected for the guardianship program. And from there, I was supposed to learn a lot of the old ceremonies that were starting to go extinct, and our tribes were losing them. And so kind of without my knowing, I was kind of put into this particular role of learning about the death world, learning about evil and darkness, and how to kind of mitigate that, how to push those back, and to maintain a balance and fight against those particular kind of negative forces. So, and like I said, it wasn't my choice to kind of fall into that role. It just more so just was kind of put upon me, like, you are the best fit, and kind of the mountain that you represent does represent these particular ceremonies as well. So this is part of your repertoire. This is part of your tool belt, what you're going to use to help the world. And it just developed ever since then. Now I'm 29 years old and have years of experience of cleansing homes, years of experience of actually doing exorcisms, what English terms would call exorcisms, kind of pushing back the darker side of things and just bringing balance back to certain places and certain people.
So when you get called in to restore the balance to a place, what does the imbalance look like? Why have you been called in? What's been happening?
Usually there's sickness or uneasy feelings is kind of like the first general sign that most people will notice. Things, I guess people like to be in a routine. People know what their home feels like. They know what it feels like when they come home. They feel safe. They can rest. They can relax. It's a sanctuary. And whether people really realize it or not, they are attuned to environment changes. They know when something's off. They have a feeling that there's something that's not supposed to be here, or there's certain aspects of their life that get changed out of their particular control or their wanting. And that's usually the first sign is like, I don't feel good. My home, I don't feel safe in my home. I'm waking up with nightmares. And if it progresses, is usually like poltergeist activity, things being moved, some messages, scratches, and it can go all the way up into actual manifestations and people actually getting hurt. So there's a lot that goes into diagnosing a particular situation, but it really is what the people that are there, what they're accustomed to, if there's changes to it, and if it feels negative in nature.
This is fascinating. So I grew up in the Catholic Church, and a lot of the research that has been done over the years has been around demonic possession, and exorcisms and things like that. And so I'm wondering, what would you say is the difference between what the Catholic Church teaches and maybe experiences and what you do?
Yeah. So with the indigenous culture, with indigenous people, the aspect of the demonic, the aspect of evil, doesn't always have to be something hellish. It's usually just something of the negative nature. It can be something of that is pretty much hellish, but to indigenous people, something that's evil or darkness is something that wants to throw you off your path. Oftentimes, individuals, they, even when they're born, young children are born and new life comes into this world, often prayer is done, and you have a path set before you of goodness. Like you want your children to do good in school, you want them to succeed with a business, to have a good relationship, things of that nature. You want their life to be as smooth as possible. But there are opposite forces that kind of go in and disrupt that. Now, when it comes to demonic side, as compared to the church, the indigenous people see darkness and evil. It can come in many different facets. It can come from nature. It can come from other tribes. It can come from spite, from greed. It can come from a lot of different negative sources, and manifest itself to something pretty dangerous. So along those lines, it's actually pretty similar, I believe, with the church as far as for how they believe something hellish comes to wreak havoc and cause imbalances.
What's interesting about the church experience is that most of us who get involved in this have to learn it on the job. It's not something that's taught in theological college. And so we're really following our noses as to what's going on, what kind of entity am I dealing with here, and then how do I get rid of it? You have the advantage that you've got generations of cultural knowledge as a guardian of the Navajo people. Did it take a long time for you to get ready to actually sort of engage at the coal face of this kind of work?
Very much so. It took quite a bit. Now, as an indigenous youth, indigenous person, we are raised with kind of like a base knowledge, a base understanding of what not to do and the consequences of these certain actions. Our elders would tell us, don't do this, otherwise such and such is going to happen. And so we understood at that level. And when I went into my guardianship and my training, I had to be able to really deeply understand those particular reasons, like how step by step a dark entity comes about, how a negative energy grows, or how dark entity, their particular powers, their particular curses, their songs, their ceremonies on their end, how they work and how to unwind all of it, how to bring back balance that is from a situation of chaos. So they say, "Ayush aya ti ti hui di ne ho chiu lo zi." There's much like how you said the church there, you learn on the job, you learn from the stories, you learn from the lessons, but your true lessons begin when you are confronting these things, when you are confronting cases of either demonic possession or the darkness coming through. And it was a real eye-opening experience because as a kid, I would go to ceremonies, I would see the medicine people dealing with some darker entities sometimes, but to actually be the one at the helm, being the one that's doing the songs, doing the ceremonies, and feeling the effects of darkness try to kind of invade your mind, cast doubt upon you, mess up your songs or prayers, you are going to end up being the one that's in charge of the ceremony. You're in charge of the patient and the safety of everyone involved in that particular ceremony. There's a lot more that's on your plate and a lot more you have to think about when performing these ceremonies.
I have so many questions, David. So you have probably, I'm sure you've attended many of these call outs from people who believe there's a negative entity present or their environment feels unbalanced in some way. So when you actually attend these homes or these places, how many of these times have you actually found that whatever these people are experiencing is more, let's say, psychologically driven rather than an actual negative entity or, something like that?
It's very interesting because the majority, and I say almost, I hate to put a number on it, but I'd say over 90% of my particular ceremonial cases is usually something along the lines of either psychological or their own doing something wrong, and they may possibly not even knowing that they did something wrong, and just causing them to be out of balance, or it's something that can be easily solved with a simple ceremony. But there is that small percentage of times where it does get dark. But I would have to say it is on the majority level psychological or very easy cases of what we call that's kind of self manifestations where they created the negativity themselves and even it kind of manifesting into something, I guess, humanesque.
When you discern that that's the case, that it's actually perhaps the social behavior of the family in a house that's generated the problem, do you sit down and do family therapy with them? What's the next step?
Very much so. So kind of how the ceremony goes is you sit down, you set up our particular altar. You kind of get the feeling of what's going to happen by the first initial contact. Usually a patient will call you or go to your home and then give some sort of offering, be like, I need some help. Can you come to my home? Can you come to my place of residence? Or if it's themselves, can you help me? I'm feeling off. And you can first start diagnosing the situation. That whole process takes place from first interaction. And it goes all the way to when we set up our altar. We're either at the person's location or we're at a sacred site that we perform our ceremonies in. You start diagnosing the situation. You find out what it is. And if it does happen to be those particular cases of the patient kind of their own self-doing or their own psychology, their own social behaviors that cause this particular imbalance, you then start kind of going into like a therapy, like what caused this? Is it a relationship? Is it a certain feeling, a thought process? And you kind of get down into it and you start just kind of going as far as the patient will allow you. And what's interesting about these particular ceremonies is the particular altar and the spiritual interactions we have, they tend to bring stuff out that the patient either doesn't realize that they did or something that they're hiding. And that's very interesting and unique within, I think, indigenous culture is they say, Yaho, you can't lie to the paraphernalia. You can't lie to the spirits. They know what's going on almost better than you do. And so that's something that you, as a practitioner, as someone who's kind of like the bridge, I'm not necessarily the one that's doing the miracles. I always give credit to the spirits. I give credit to my paraphernalia and the ceremony. They're the ancestors. They're the ones that do this. I'm just the interpreter. I'm just the one that speaks on their behalf and just kind of acts on their behalf. So you dive deep into a patient's mind and into their life, and you do perform a sense of psychological therapy. And you help them out, realize things. You help them, kind of encourage them. You bring balance to them and give them new strength. They come to you with a problem, so you do your best to solve that problem and then enhance them to where they can go on with protection, go on with encouragement, go on with strength, that they can live their life the best way that they possibly can.
I'll give the mic back to Michael in a moment, but I've got to pick up on something you said there, David, which will have intrigued people. You said you can't lie to the spirits, you can't lie to the paraphernalia. Can you tell us a little something about the paraphernalia?
So the paraphernalia, it's our altar that we set up. And I always hate using English words because English has associated those particular words with not the best mental imagery. But paraphernalia into the indigenous people is the sand that we gather from the four sacred mountains. On top of that is the crystal that a medicine person goes to go harvest on their own through their spiritual journeys. You have the feathers, the sacred eagle feathers there. You have the charcoal, the fireplace, along with the fire poker there, the grandfather fire poker there to be able to quell the flames. You have the water, you have the seashells, you have all these particular elements of the altar that represents the elements of the world. It literally represents creation. And when you have that altar set up, they say you acknowledge creation, and a spirit from every one of those worlds is present in the ceremony looking upon the patient. So that's what the paraphernalia mean. We call it jish in our language. That's the medicine man's sacred tools. And they have spirits of their own, and they're representatives of their particular worlds. And just like how you walk around this world, you breathe air, you walk on this earth, the stars see you, the sun, the moon, all elements are present when in your existence. So if they see you, they understand your thoughts, they understand your actions, they see your actions. So there's no lying to them because they've seen you and they care for you and they want the best for you.
Good answer.
Thank you.
I like that. So, okay, so in a small percentage of cases that you see where there is something more sinister going on, I would like to ask you what you actually do. What's the procedure? What's the process? How do you rebalance or I guess expel the negative energy? Because when I think of these things, and I'm by no means an expert in this area at all, but I go back to shows like Supernatural where, you know, they use salt and iron and they burn a possessed object that might be connected with the spirit or something like that. And is what they do in that show, is that accurate, or is that just Hollywood stuff? Like I'd love to learn what you do and how accurate these Hollywood representations are.
Yeah, so when it comes to shows or movies, there's always an element of Hollywood in them to make it more exciting, to make it more intense. But the actual reality of these things is often more intense than what you see in Hollywood, more emotionally impactful, more fearful, and there's a sense of reality that strikes compared to just watching something through a screen. Now, when we determine that there is something dark, malevolent, so that there is something possibly demonic or possibly evil that is affecting a person or a place, we usually determine that right away. We determine it in the diagnosis, oftentimes even before setting up our altar, because we have different altars, we have different paraphernalia that we use for certain different ceremonial situations. Now, when you set up your particular altar, or when you set up your particular instance, if you're allowed to, and what I mean by that is sometimes you go into a patient's home and the activity kicks off right out the bat, and you don't have time to set up your altar properly. But then there are times where the particular entity or being is being coy, is kind of hiding away a little bit, and you do have time to set up your altar properly. Those particular setups are usually done with more of the warrior aspects in mind. You have the black jet, the arrowhead, the igneous stone. Then you have a different type of crystal, a smoky quartz crystal. You have different elements that are more of the warrior sense to the ceremony, because you have to prepare yourself like a warrior going into battle, because you are going to be dealing with something that could potentially harm you, harm the patients, or harm someone in the nearby vicinity. So you have to be ready to take care of your patient. And that's a mindset, a mental switch that you have to have going into these situations is, okay, it's no longer just trying to find out what's ailing them and diagnosing them that. This is actually dealing with something more intense. This is something that could hurt someone. And you have to be able to mentally prepare yourself for that. So you have different songs, different ceremonies, very similar to the kind of the Catholic exorcists, to where they have a particular book that they read prayers out of, and they have a mindset, they have their protect objects. So very similar to that. But in the indigenous culture, you have to go down to its roots. And so it's not, you have the songs and the ceremonies, yes, but you have to remain active in the situation. And what I mean by that is your mind has to be actively looking at the situation. You have to be like, okay, is it planted somewhere? What kind of entity is this? What type of energy does it derive from? Is it intelligent or is it beastly? You have to really kind of dance. They say, you dance with your enemy to find out who your enemy is and how to best dispatch them or send them on their way. So it's very much a warrior mindset. It's a very much a warrior type battle. And that's why us younger ones who were taught these particular ceremonies were taught them, because it's based off of the warrior mindset. And a lot of the elders that can't move, that can't actually do combat, they kind of leave these ceremonies to the younger ones. Hence why some of them are starting to go extinct, because they weren't able to teach it to the younger ones. But us being young, agile enough to be able to dance with them, you go and find out the enemy. You find out their roots, and you dig out the roots. Oftentimes they say, the enemy has made a spider web, a kind of a clump of hair, a clump of whatever they were trying to do. And while you're doing the ceremony, while you're making sure your patients are okay, and you're doing the songs and prayers, you're also mentioning in the spiritual languages how you're unraveling the curses, you're unraveling their prayers, you're unraveling their misdeeds, and you're kind of bringing back goodness, you're bringing back balance, and you're making it, if it was something deadly, you're making it something good. You're making that energy flow back again until you get to its root. And once you find its root, you upheave it based on whatever element it's based out of. You either that, or the root itself is the spirit. You find out where it's hiding, or you find out who it is. And oftentimes there is actual combat that happens with blessed objects. Just how you see in when people do exorcisms, they have the cross, they call upon the sacred archangels, they call upon Jesus, they call upon God, the creator. Very much so, you yourself are a tool to get rid of these dark entities, and you yourself are the ones that stands in between them and your patient, and you say, no more. This is going to be done. You're either going to go away, or we're going to deal with it right here, and you're going to be non-existent anymore.
Obviously, some of these entities are very terrifying to us. What are the entities frightened of, and how do they understand what they see you doing when you go into these places?
It's very interesting, and something that I'm still learning. I'm still very young at this. I've been doing it for quite some time, but I'm never going to claim that I know all of it or I know everything. They will know. They'll kind of read you. They just like I said, how we're dancing. They look at you, and you look at them, and they're learning about you as well. So when you interact with these particular entities, you have to be able to understand that these beings, they're there to cause upheaval. They're there to cause imbalances. And I'm trying to kind of best explain that in English, but basically what that means is you have to be able to understand what you're facing is not of your physical realm per se, something of the darker of a negative entity. It's really hard to describe in English. It's something that can change face. It's something that can change realms and worlds, and it's directly opposing what the creator has set before you. And so you to be able to understand what you're dealing with and to be able to how to interact and deal with it, it takes a lot. And they'll find out who you are, and you have to be strong with who yourself and your base and your roots and who you are.
And they communicate back to you?
There are times, like I said, if they are intelligent, they can often interact. You have tools. More modern day tools kind of is there to be able to have them speak. Usually it's done through action. Like I said, very rarely is it to where they are speaking to where even the patient hears them or they see them, they manifest. That's on a rare case basis, and usually those are very powerful entities that you have to be really careful with. But the interactions are usually done with action, usually done with feeling, usually the paraphernalia, the altar will tell you kind of what's going on as well.
Have you ever come up against an entity or an energy that is just too powerful for you?
Yes. There's been several times where I've been outclassed, I've been outdone, and I have had to call upon my the elders who know a little bit more. Oftentimes, when it comes to cases like that, we have to bring in more of our teammates, more of our people who know the songs and ceremonies and make it a group effort to deal with something. Let's take, for example, the Mummy Cave at Canyon de Shea on the Navajo Nation. So this cave was the site of a great massacre that happened to the indigenous Diné people. When the military was rounding up the indigenous people, we would often flee and try to hide. One particular location was a cave, and in this cave, they hid, and the military still came. And what they ended up doing is killing hundreds of indigenous people within that cave and leaving their bodies there. Over time, that cave became synonymous with death and evil actually learned to utilize the massacre and the negative energy that happened in there, and they actually fed it and manifested an evil kind of a beast that was kind of derived from all that that genocide that happened right there.
So are you talking
And
about a
they
physical beast?
this is a physical place that
Physical beast that was manifest?
let's say that one more time, sorry.
A physical beast. So are you talking about it's a physical beast was manifest, or are you talking about an energetic beast?
And a physical and spiritual beast. And what I mean by that is that there were times that there have been sightings where it did manifest into something physical and
Wow.
attack people, feed upon people, but most of the time it was spiritual and just the negative feelings that you have there. And it was actually it's this place known as Mummy Cave in Canyon de Shea. And scientists have gone in there. They've recovered the mummies of the indigenous people that were there. And it's very synonymous with a lot of darkness in our tribe. So in order to deal with that, and this is before my time, was my great-grandfather, Hastine Tonjone. He went and got the whole council of the Navajo people, and he was the main one that led the ceremony to put like a bubble over there to contain the darkness and evil. And they say, as a normal person, you're not supposed to go to the places like that, and it's there contained. It's not supposed to spread. Well, as of recent days, scientists went in there, and then curious people will go in there, and it ended up destroying that shield. And so I had to call upon the people again, the higher up people, the high council, to be able to restore that shield. I couldn't have done it myself, but instances like that is you call upon your resources, you call upon the spirits, you call upon those that know more than you, and you have to take these situations very seriously. And you have to be very cautious because it is either your patient on the line, the people in the vicinity on the line, or even yourself as a warrior. You put yourself on the line.
Have you heard of the Skinwalker Ranch, David?
Yes. Very synonymous in our area.
Yeah, right. Yes, because it is in your area, I believe, and what you just described in the cave sounds very similar to what has happened at the Skinwalker Ranch, where there's been some kind of whether it's an interdimensional or multi-dimensional portal or something at the Skinwalker Ranch, and people have actually had sightings of physical entities and beasts, and they've attacked people and all the rest of it. Is this similar?
Very similar. I'm not a huge fan of the name of the ranch. I know that's just kind of what it's called. More pop culture have given fame to this particular entity known as the Skinwalker. We call it the Unagloshi, and they're starting to claim that everything's a Skinwalker now. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Skinwalkers are only found in the Four Corners region, and the reason why it was called Skinwalker Ranch is because Skinwalker Ranch is actually located right near the borders of the Utes and the Navajo people. And this particular old pathway is an old pathway that evil people who sought to do evil deeds and learning that pathway to be of the darkness, that was actually one of the paths that they would take. And one of the trials that they would try to, I guess, learning their way was set near Skinwalker Ranch. Very similar. I'm glad you picked up on that because The Canyon de Shea, if you were to ever visit there, and this is about, I'd say, 200 miles away from Skinwalker Ranch, this canyon is a lot of old stories with our indigenous heritage and our indigenous coming into this world stories, our creation stories. And in the canyon, there's a certain point where the story, like you start in the canyon and you tell the story of our creation. You get to a certain point in the canyon and it splits off. The right, you go down the right side, you learn about the good, you learn how to become a good medicine person, you learn those good stories of goodness. But on the left, if you want to learn the dark way, that's where you go. And over there is that mummy cave, which ended up being one of the trials that they have to face if they want to learn the dark side, kind of a duality like that.
That's amazing.
There are a couple of layers in the mummy cave story which are interesting, and one is what I would call the archonic layer. So that's the idea of a parasitic energy-based entity that is going to feed off misery, terror, sorrow, all the energy of a genocide. And then there's the human side of that story, all the anguish and pain of the genocide itself. So there seem to be two elements that you might have to respond to: the energy-based entity that's been called forth, and then the human experience. And I wondered if you could pick apart those two strands for us.
Definitely. And I'm glad you call it strands, because there's plenty of strands that go along with this particular location. So when it comes to the spiritual side of the entity that was kind of created and birthed from this energy of genocide, it created like it's birthed an intelligence of its own. It feasts upon people's fear, people's anguish, people's sorrow. Even when they're in proximity to it, they'll feed on that. They'll feed on even the plants. No plants grow in that vicinity. No trees grow in that vicinity. It feeds off of all life force, because that's just kind of what it is. That's what it feeds upon. Whether this is something that's interesting that I'm trying to think about too, is something birthed from darkness, and all it knows is darkness. All it knows is this particular type of food that nourishes it. Is it truly something that it chose to be dark? It chose to do that? Or is it birthed from it and is more beastly to where that's just what satisfies it? It's a very interesting when you go about the prayers of it, is because you're talking to not necessarily the intelligence of the monster. When you're saying these prayers, you are saying these prayers towards the energy of it, the negativity of it, and the clashing of the good, the bad, and the in-betweens, the how it interacts. So that's something that when you deal with a beastly energy, when you deal with something of a negative source that is not necessarily intelligent to where it made its own choice, but it's just surviving, you have to acknowledge the realm that it came from, acknowledge its birth, acknowledge its negativity. And they say you have to acknowledge both sides of it, just like how we humans, we have the capacity for good, we have the capacity for darkness. Even at birth, we have these capacities, but it is in our nature to grow, and how we are shaped that turns into what it ends up being. So to attack the second strand, when you're looking at the energy of the history of a location, there's no erasing history, unfortunately. There's no getting rid of what happened in the past. What you can do is to try to calm the energy enough to where it's not going to affect as much the surrounding environments. Like when you go to, let's say, the Civil War battleground, or you're to go to some place where a great tragedy happened, there's really not a whole lot to do as far as for erasing it. There's a part of it's always going to be there. Even if you cleanse an area, that story is always going to be there. But how it interacts with the environment, how it interacts with the people, that's something you can control. The energy and how, kind of where you place something on a shelf, that's what you can control. And that's something that as indigenous people, we understand and acknowledge something bad happened here. But we have a certain mission. We have a certain duty. We have a certain life that we live. And if we have to pass by this dark place, we acknowledge it, let it be there, and we continue on with whatever we're trying to do.
Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Go for it, Paul.
I have a friend who had an interesting experience on a driving holiday one time. He was driving with his young daughter. She was about 6 years old, and they were crossing through this particular territory when he suddenly noticed that his daughter, who's in the back seat, was talking to an invisible person in the car. And so he just eavesdropped to the conversation, and they seemed to be having this fun, light-hearted conversation. And then something happened, and his daughter became very, very sad and went very quiet. And it was when they got to the motel at the end of that leg of the journey that he asked her about this conversation. And she said that she had been in conversation with a Native American boy who was telling him all about her life. And then at some point in the conversation, she asked, "Where are your parents?" And he started talking about this massacre that had happened. Well, he had never heard of this massacre. So this was some years ago. So instead of going online, he went to the library, looked it up, and discovered, yes, where they were driving through, there was this terrible massacre that had happened. He felt he had to do something about that. And what he felt he needed to do, along with a large number of other people, was to go back to that place and grieve for the people who had died and acknowledge them. And there was a sense that they were not doing this just to process their own sadness, but because the dead wanted to be remembered. They wanted to be acknowledged. And I wonder if you've come across that sort of aspect to responding to places that have a trapped negative energy in them.
Very much so. And that's something that's huge with even just setting up a ceremonial altar or doing a ceremony in indigenous culture is acknowledgement. Because when you go to a place, you have to acknowledge the spirits that were there and the energies that are there, whether ancient or more modern, because some energy is trapped, whether it's conscious or not. Memory, like there's some certain locations and ceremonies where memories replay with certain conditions are met. And there in those particular moments of replay, I have found sometimes that those particular spirits have a sense of intelligence, and that you can interact with them a little bit until those conditions are no longer met, and it's almost like a sense of like they forget and the clock resets and everything resets. And so there is a lot of times where we go to sacred sites or we go to sites of massacres of that have negative energies, and you do sit there and grieve. It's like grieving with your ancestors, grieving with those that had tragic ends, or those that passed on before you. You acknowledge them and say, "I'm sorry for what happened," or "I understand who you are. I see you. I acknowledge you." And from here, we usually offer tobacco or food or some other type of offering and acknowledging them, because their time with for whatever reason, some outside source ended their prayer, ended their song, ended their ceremony abruptly. And so from there, you give them that acknowledgement, you give them that love, that energy, and whether it quells the energy for a certain amount of time, or it helps things kind of move on, it's all up to the type of energy you're interacting with.
I'd love to open this up and explore this, what you just said a little bit around acknowledgement, because I took some notes from what you were talking about earlier here around, we apply these labels on these entities as, very human motivations, if you might say. And we say words like negative and evil. And then you touched on the fact that, this evil is born into itself almost, and it has this intrinsic motivation to almost feed on the thing that sustains them in some way, which could be fear, it could be what we label as negative and all the rest of it. And I wonder, how do our judgments on motivation, coming from a human perspective, understanding that we assume that the intent is possession to overcome with malicious intent, when in fact it could be just their survival mechanism, these entities. How do you then deal with that when you're trying to expel an entity or trying to rebalance an environment or whatever? Is part of this about acknowledging that there might not be this malicious intent there? There might be just some semblance of survival from their perspective, and they are totally unaware of the fact that they're having a damaging effect on the human or the environment?
Very much so. So I'm glad you picked up on that. That's a very wise perception. And that's the key word, is perception. So to us, like, we'll go to the lessons of the elders. When you confront the bear, when you confront the mountain lion, when you confront an alpha predator that can harm and kill a human, what is its motivation? When you cross paths, it's going to bare its teeth, it's going to bare its claws, it's going to defend itself, whether it has cubs nearby or it's its hunting ground. It feels threatened by you. To you, that's dark and evil because it's threatening your life and your existence. To the mountain lion or to the alpha predator, it's the same thing. They see you as evil because you're threatening their existence. You're encroaching upon their area. And so there's a certain level of conflict that's there. But when you step back, is the mountain lion or the alpha predator truly evil? Are they going out to hunt something for just malicious intent? Are they hunting for sport, or are they hunting to survive? What is the motivation with these particular entities? Whether if we see them as evil or if they truly are evil, that's something that you, as the medicinal person, you as the one running the ceremony, you have to determine this. Because if you're going out guns blazing, just getting rid of any negative entity, that's not balance. That's literally, you're fighting for what you perceive as good, your moral alignments, your perceptions, and you're making a world shaped in your perception when other beings may not see the world the same way as you do. You have to be able to see the bigger picture, how elements and entities interact with each other. There are some beings that are of the evil side that do seek to cause chaos and cause imbalances. But like you said, there are some beings that have some intrinsic just need to survive. And that's just what ends up sustaining them, is what we perceive as negative emotions. To them, that's their food. That's what they enjoy. That brings them, in a sense, happiness and allows them to survive. So when we interact with those particular beings, we interact with those particular energies, we have to determine the flow. We have to determine the roles that are placed. Sometimes, let's say someone builds a home on an ancestral sacred site where there is an ancient entity that's there and that hasn't been acknowledged. You go to this person's home and they're like, there's weird things happening. My home's just being haunted. No one's died here because it was just built 3 months ago. What's going on? And so you talk to that ancient being, you talk to the spirits that are around, you acknowledge it, and you also introduce this particular entity with the new occupants of the land, the new home, and say, you have to have that person understand this entity, this being was here way before this home was built, way before this person decided to live here. And so there has to be a sense of living with this entity, cohabitating with this entity, a sense of respect, a sense of acknowledgement, saying, I will give you offering, and in return, can I stay here for my short time in this world, however short my time is in this home. I may decide to move, but for now, I acknowledge you. I acknowledge your presence, your energy, and we're going to live and cohabitate in this realm together in a good way. That's the best case scenario. And that's something that you, as the medicine person, the practitioner, you have to determine every situation.
Yes, where I live in Canberra, there are plans to build townhouses on an ancestral meeting ground. So you might be getting some work from this part of the world soon, David. I wanted to ask you about the human aspect of the story again, because I got drawn into this world of entity removal in the context of church ministry, and it was often invitations into places where people were saying, my house is haunted, or everyone who lives here gets sick, or everyone who worships at this church gets sick. And there are all these indications of some kind of a disturbance. And a lot of the time it is a negative energy that has to be moved on somehow. And that was what I thought entity removal was until I had an experience of my own in a relatively new house that had been built in a beautiful part of Canberra. But it was a house that had a girl living in it that we didn't know who she was and where she was coming from. And she just started appearing, and it was one of my children who was seeing her. And again, this is learning on the job. I had no background in how to respond to this. All my background was in combating these strong, dark, sick-making entities. But this was just a little girl with the scraggly red hair. And straight away, I thought, my tools are not the right tools for this. I have to find an appropriate way of responding, because it seemed to be a case of a human spirit who was lost, who didn't know where she was, who needed help moving on. And so I won't go into the details of how we dealt with it, but how would you deal with that?
So that's like, I like how you say you didn't quite have the appropriate tools. Like how I mentioned earlier, our particular altar, you have to determine what tools you're going to use on the ceremony based on the type of energies or spirits you interact with. So with a little child spirit or an innocent being, an innocent spirit that's just either lost, hasn't moved on, you have to kind of approach it with as if they were physical, just as real, or I guess as touchable as we are. And you go up to this little kid. You have to have a sense of empathy. If it is a real legitimate child whose spirit's there is lost, you understand that they are scared. You have to understand that they don't know exactly what's going on. They may have a little bit of an idea, but they may not know exactly what's going on. And you go in there, you have to really show your heart in a sense. When you determine that this being is in no way malicious, you show your heart. And like you go up to a little kindergartner, a little kid, hi, how's it going? Your tone changes, your energy changes, your interaction changes. Instead of being a complete warrior mode, you're in Papa Bear mode. You're in Mom and Dad mode. You're in something like, hey, what's going on? Can you tell me a little bit of story? Or if they're willing to, they might tell you a little bit of their story. Maybe that's something all they need is they want to tell their story told. They might be hungry. They might be thirsty. They might need something that you can provide. And from there, once you get them calm and you get them to just like a little child, you're not just going to say, go and bust into a home, get a child and be like, all right, you're free. Here you go. And just toss them into the nether or whatever. That's not how you handle those situations. Instead, you have to have that empathy. Hey, little kid, little girl, how's it going? I'm here. This is who I am. And you introduce yourself in that kind way. And you gain, I don't want to say gaining their trust, because that's more of like you have a malicious intent, really. But you have they can read your intent. They can read your thoughts. They can read your energy. And you're like, if you want to go, I have an option for you. And you explain to them, not necessarily the human occupants, you explain to that spirit, either vocally or through your thoughts or your energy, this is how this is going to be. I want you to experience something amazing. Go on into this next world. And for us indigenous people, when we cross people over or someone passes on and they go into the next realm, we utilize a horse. A horse gets them to the start of their journey point and takes them to the start of the next realm. So you say, I have a pretty horsey here. I have a beautiful horse. Come look. And then at that point is you do the songs and ceremony to summon the horse or to bring forth the carrier, the one that's going to transfer them over. And you get them to trust it. You get them to be happy about it. You get them to feel good. And that's a huge thing. Instead of commanding something to happen, you have to understand that that's what they want. If they want to stay, because there are some spirits that choose to stay in a particular location, you're like, okay, this is you want to be here. Let me make you as comfortable as possible. Let me make you as happy as possible. And I'm going to give you offering, whatever you need. If you need your story told, whatever you need, that's what I'm here for. I'm going to acknowledge you and I'm going to help however I can.
I was really fortunate in the instance I described because I just followed my nose. I did more or less as you describe, although I didn't have any. Well, I invented my own ceremony, I suppose, really, now I think about it. But my wife had a dream And then there was a sensitive I was in contact with who was in another country. And between the three of us, we got a picture of what was happening and what needed to happen and how and when it had been resolved. But having had that experience, I realized, experiences like this are ages old. But in my British and Australian culture, I don't have any knowledge. I had to learn from scratch in the moment, whereas you represent a continual tradition going back thousands of years that has carried this information. Do you find that you get invitations specifically for that reason, because of all the Navajo wisdom that you carry with you, so that you're not going into a situation and inventing the wheel from scratch?
It's an interesting kind of conundrum, because like, for me personally, I have a lot to draw from. I have a lot of songs, a lot of ceremonies, a lot of stories, and a lot of upbringing and experience with what I've done. But some words that my teacher, Chief Silver Eagle, told me. He says, you're going to go into a situation, and I want you to have an empty cup. And that confused me at first. I said, what do you mean? I thought I have all these songs, these ceremonies, these altars. I have all these tools here. He says, go into every situation with an empty cup. You're going to learn something new from every situation. Every situation is not going to be cookie cutter. Every situation that you're going to come across, you're going to have to almost invent a new ceremony, because every situation is different. Every situation is going to come from someone different. It's going to have a different energy. It's going to have a different person. You don't want to be able to record your ceremony and then distribute it, have it on replay, and someone's going to be able to recreate it. No, that's not helping.
Yeah.
What you have to change the prayer up. Instead of saying, for all the beings of the star world, maybe you want to mention a very particular star entity. Maybe you want to mention a very particular mountain. Or, this is the summertime, I want to mention the spirit of the summer instead of the spirit of the winter. You have to adjust and morph with each situation and each ceremony.
So that brings up a question for me. How do you adequately train for this job, for this role, if every single interaction is going to be incredibly different?
It's extremely difficult. It takes a lot of learning, and it's very interesting, because like that, my mentor, Chief Silver Eagle, said, he says, empty your cup. You have these tools to help you with these situations, but you're going to go into it fresh and brand new. It's these tools that you do have that can help you and start you on your path, give you a guideline, kind of like a general template. You have, an assignment, and here's your parameters. Up to you what you make of it. Here's your paint set. Here's your colors. Maybe you want to bring your own colors. Here's your canvas. It's up to you what you make of it. So a good basis of understanding, of knowledge, and understanding of many different cultures. Empathy is huge. Empathizing with your patient, empathizing with the spirits, the energy around, and just a base understanding of where you are. Know where you are in the world. Know the people that are around. And even outside of ceremony, talk with the spirits that are around, that are ancient. Acknowledge them. Acknowledge the celestial beings, the interdimensional beings, the beings that of time and without time, the beings that are all around. They're there to help you too. You call upon them and say, I don't know how to handle the situation. I need help. You have seen everything more than I have. I'm just a young human who's been on this world for so long. You have seen everything. Help me. I'll be your bridge. I'll be your tool. Just tell me what I need to do.
David, we've got a couple more questions. We could talk all day, but just so you know how to pace yourself, I'll ask another question. Michael, you can have one ready, and then we'll pause on this chapter of our conversation, but it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation so far. People will have a certain picture of your approach and what you do, and you've described the paraphernalia, and you described the jish, and we know something of your background. What people might not know from this conversation is that you do use technology as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm a lead investigator for Unearthing the Supernatural. It's kind of a paranormal investigative group. And this is something that we've gone on just the past few years. is we're tackling a couple different problems with this particular bringing about the technology. Is a huge problem is the ceremonies are going extinct. The languages are going extinct. There are tribes each and every day that are going extinct because the last elder that knew the language fluently passes away, unfortunately. And when the language goes, the ceremonies and songs go with it, and the understanding of these go with it. So we are at a time now where we have tools and devices to be able to record these particular ceremonies, these particular songs, these particular interactions, and use it for teaching, use it for reaching out to people to have an understanding. A big thing with Unearthing the Supernatural is we grew up kind of watching these more popular ghost hunting shows or these paranormal shows, and we enjoyed it as kids. But going through these ceremonies, going through actual paranormal events and interacting with these spirits, we come to find out that these shows have huge missing pieces of interaction, of connecting, of actually providing solutions. There's huge holes missing. So my brother says, why don't we show that to people? The actual true way of interacting with spirits, of giving them respect, giving them offering, helping them out. And my huge rebuttal that I had was, we can't tell all our sacred songs and stories. We can't record everything for people. And our solution to that was, we can give them a taste and we control what we can put out there. And if people want to learn more, we can sit by the fire and we can tell more, or we can show them more. But we still protect the sacred, but at the same time, we get the wheels turning. We get the mind going to where people are like, that is how it's supposed to be done. That, because for thousands and thousands of years, the indigenous people have been interacting with spirits on a daily basis. We grew up with them. We lived in harmony with them. We helped them with creation. And it's just up until recently, when the settlers came over into the North American continent, that kind of was lost with genocide, with sickness, and with the hardships that happened with the residential schools, and everything was kind of shoved all that aside. Now we're at a point to where we're on that healing road. We're on that healing process of regrowth. And now we need to provide those interactions again. These spirits are starving. These spirits are hungry for that interaction, that acknowledgement. There are entire tribes going missing or are dying off. And now they have no one to take care of their spirits, take care of their offerings. And so if we can at least show a little bit of who we are, how we interact with spirits, maybe the world will get a little bit better and more people will acknowledge the spirits around them, will acknowledge the place that they live. And like in the situation where the new homeowner is built next to an ancient being's home, there can be, without us having to go to every single home, they can figure it out for themselves. Let's do a little offering here. If there's something awry, maybe I can do a tobacco offering or a food offering and acknowledge the beings that are around us.
That's beautiful, actually. I have a burning question now that Paul mentioned that you use technology. I have my burning question is, when you go out and you attend these places, do you bring a proton pack with you?
No, I need to bring a proton pack. That's very interesting. Is something to produce energy, something to produce that type of it. Allow an avenue for the spirits to come through. That's something that is something I want to do, and we're still learning. I mean, I have done these ceremonies for years and years and years. Going to actually carrying cameras with us, and I guess almost like personifying what we feel, personifying our interactions to where someone that's not there can almost see, almost feel what we interact with. It's something really hard to do because a lot of spiritual interaction has to be done in person. Only your human body is the best tool to feel the energies, to feel the interactions. Your human body is the antenna, is the tool. But to personify that, to translate that to an audience that's far, far away, that's a difficult task and something we're still trying to master and find the right tools to allow these spirits to talk and to allow these spirits to tell their stories. And I think what we found too is interesting is these spirits want their stories told. They're like, we can tell it to everyone that comes by, but we tell them, hey, a whole world can hear your story. A whole world can hear who you are and what you've done. If this is where you choose to stay and you have a story, a burning, itching story in your mind that you want to tell, here's your opportunity. And we've had amazing evidence with that.
Wonderful. Well, that's the perfect segue to telling people how they can watch you in action, hear these stories, see and feel what it looks like as you go about this work. Tell us about Unearthing the Supernatural and how people can follow your work.
Definitely. So, Unearthing the Supernatural, definitely look us up on YouTube. We're on all the major social media channels, Facebook, Instagram. We actually have a TikTok now, kind of more towards the modern audiences. And you can look us up on unearthingthesupernatural.com. We are still pretty fresh in this whole industry, but we're making huge waves in the whole paranormal industry, because the paranormal industry, basically, they've established that there is something there. Now, what do you do with those interactions? What's next? That's what we're trying to do, is trying to teach people, here's what you do next. Here's what we've always done. And here's how you can adapt it to the modern day. So definitely reach out to us, send us messages, share your stories with us. And we always like to say, we are one story of thousands. We are the few of many. Let us hear yours.
That's beautiful.
David, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. We've really enjoyed this conversation. We'd love to probe further, but we'll pause for today and just say thank you for taking us on this amazing journey to the Fringe.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. Many blessings to all your listeners and everyone. Hayalti ayokund anahokuyahe.